Good morning and welcome to Sunday School at First Baptist Church as we begin this study today in the book of Hosea. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the story of Hosea, and we'll be covering that entire story to begin with as we talk about the book of Hosea, because I think it's important that you get that before we talk about what's important here and what God is trying to teach us here, what the writer is trying to teach us here. As we begin in Hosea, we'll have several lessons in the book of Hosea. I want you to remember the point here of this first lesson is that God is offering grace to people even when they've been unfaithful to Him. Isn't that great? Because if God were not offering grace to people who have been unfaithful, we'd all be in a pickle. God offers grace to us all because we've all sinned. And so He offers grace to us all. So let's take a minute here to talk about what the story of Hosea is, because if we don't get this story first and some of the things that he's trying to teach, we might get bogged down and miss some of the truth here, thinking about the story and trying to get it right in our mind. Here's the story. Hosea married a woman named Gomer. As a result of that marriage, 3 children were born to them: Jezreel, Lo-Ruhamah, and Lo-Ammi. Then Gomer was unfaithful to Hosea, and he cast her out according to the law. After a period of time, when she had gone just about as low as she could go, she became a slave, since there was no other way open to her. And despite all of this, Hosea sought her out, and he bought her for the price of a slave and restored her to his side as his bride. Wow, what a story. G. Campbell Morgan says that this is the story told bluntly. The first part is tragic, but it's not uncommon. The second part is by no means common and is absolutely amazing. With the first part, we are familiar. It is tragic, heartbreaking, but not unknown. But the story of a man seeking a woman when she has passed through all the period of passion and has lost her value on the material level and is merely a slave, and such a man going after her, buying her for 30 shekels and bringing her back and restoring her to his side as his bride, is something very uncommon. And I would agree. It's very, very uncommon. This is a fascinating story in and of itself. Now, what are the messages here that we're going to be looking for that Hosea is trying to teach us? First, Hosea focuses on the nature of revelation and the transforming power of a personal relationship with the Lord. God uses him in a very personal way to reveal things about the nation of Israel. Second, love is integral to the book of Hosea. Love that's implicit in the actions of the prophet, and a love which is made explicit in Hosea specifically emphasizes love's transforming, redeeming power, what God's love can do. Third, Hosea, like all the other prophets of the Old Testament, understood that all their proclamations had to do with the covenant context, the covenant that they had made with God. They're deeply steeped in the legal covenant traditions, and they're understood as reformers who call men to live in light of the covenant generation in their own generation. And so his fundamental role as a prophet and the others is to help people to understand what they're supposed to do during their generation in relation to God's covenant. Fourth, sin in the book of Hosea is clearly defined. Its structure is delineated. It's at its core here in this Old Testament book. The infidelity to covenant bonds is sin if you don't remain true to what the covenant said. And it is analogous to the infidelity of a marriage, of an adulteress who abandons her husband and in so doing breaks the promises of marriage. Just as Israel had violated the covenant, Gomer had violated her marriage covenant with Hosea. And then finally, there's a marked emphasis here on grace and forgiveness by God. Even in wrath with God, there's always love. And in judgment, He always tempers it with mercy. Hosea saw that God had a divine restraint in his redeeming judgment for Israel and for Judah a little bit later on. Israel's infidelity is not necessarily something that needs to be punished. It needs to be healed. And the great physician heals that infidelity. I will heal their faithlessness, he said in verse 4 of chapter 14. I will love them freely, for my anger has turned from them. And so, keeping those things in mind as we look at the book of Hosea, let's begin here in chapter 1 with verses 1 and 2. Hosea writes this: The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, and Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, Go take to yourself an adulterous wife and children of unfaithfulness, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery and departing from the Lord. Hosea's name means salvation. How appropriate for a land that needed salvation. They needed to turn from their sin, and they needed to go back to God. They needed to be delivered, if you will. And so his name is really appropriate for this deliverance motif that's part of the book of Hosea. There was a need for national salvation, which was so apparent during the time in which he ministered. It was obvious to Hosea and to many others. He was a contemporary of Isaiah and his ministry that extended from the death of Jeroboam the second in 748 BC until the fall of the northern kingdom in 722 BC. Had an adulterous wife, and she had children. Some we're not sure if they were Hosea's or not. The scripture leaves little doubt as to the symbolism of what Hosea was being asked to demonstrate. Most commentators accept the fact that this is a historically accurate story that actually happened. Some will take it into the allegorical vein, and that's okay. The meanings end up being the same. Roy Honeycutt, writing in the Broadman Commentary, states that Gomer was in all probability a temple prostitute dedicated to Baal. Although this cannot be demonstrated in and of itself, the poignancy and significance of that action is all the more meaningful for the understanding of the relationship between Yahweh and Israel. The relationship between Hosea and Gomer is like the relationship between Yahweh and Israel. And we'll see that as we go all the way through. Israel had committed national prostitution in giving herself to the Canaanite gods. Hosea sought Gomer, a temple harlot though she was, and in so doing, he lived out in his own flesh the agony that rested deep in the heart of God in his experience with Israel. Perhaps you might have second thoughts in your mind about Hosea marrying a prostitute, but I would remind you that Salmon, who was one of the soldiers in Joshua's army conquering the Promised Land, married Rahab the harlot, and she became the great-grandmother of David and an ancestress of Jesus Christ. G. Campbell Morgan writes that Hosea came to understand the heart of God and what God suffered when his people sinned. In this commitment with God, he came to understand the sin of the nation as he could never have understood it apart from the experience of his own agony. The infidelity of Gomer interpreted to Hosea the infidelity of Israel. What Gomer did to Hosea is what Israel did to God. There's some important points I want us to understand about Baal worship before we get into the next verses. Baal was the god of winter rain and storm, and his activity was uniquely relevant to the moisture that was needed for crop production in this agrarian society. It is Baal, the people thought, who annually broke the grip of the summer drought and brought life-giving rain to the land. You see, in Israel, the rain came in the fall. The summer was dry. And the climate is there so that the rain comes in the fall, you plant in the fall, you harvest in the springs, just exactly opposite to what we do. Israel learned farming from the residents who were already there, who had been there over 1,000 years, the Canaanites. And they saw the Canaanites worshiping Baal, and so they began to ascribe the gifts of the land to Baal rather than Yahweh. And apparently they reached a point that they even called Yahweh Baal. Can you imagine that? I'm sure God definitely not happy about that. In addition, this Canaanite religion placed a strong emphasis on the fertility cult of sacred prostitutes. And so much of the message of Hosea focuses on precisely the aspect of this Canaanite religion. The people had abandoned God for this religion. And they sought meaning in this new religion where they had sought meaning in God, in Yahweh God. And so this was a big change, and it was adulterous as far as their relationship with God was concerned. Now look at verses 3 through 5, where we see Gomer being taken as a wife by Hosea. So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel. Notice that Gomer is positively identified according to family lineage, which leads me to believe, and other commentators as well, that this was really a person, historically a person. Hosea's conduct matched God's will exactly, and Hosea's action is that Gomer fit God's requirement and Hosea's personal choice as well. He married a prostitute. It was his choice, but it was a prostitute that God told him to. And it says that she bore him a son. It wasn't born out of wedlock. It was born in wedlock. So it's legitimate. And then when it talks about call him Jezreel, all of the children of Hosea, their names have significance. Jezreel is in reference to the valley of Jezreel. It is in reference to what Jehu, king of Israel, had done to eliminate all the descendants of Ahab. He wiped out all the heirs of Ahab. And the prophecy from Hosea is that Israel will pay dearly for this act. Then look in verses 6 and 7. Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call her Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no longer show love to the house of Israel, that I should at all forgive them. Yet I will show love to the house of Judah, and I will save them not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses and horsemen, but by the Lord their God. Lo-Ruhamah. This means not loved, no mercy, unpitied. Can you imagine a little girl having that name, and every time they called her name, that's what they were calling her? What it meant to the people of Israel, though, was ominous. God would show no mercy to Israel. If the people wondered if Hosea had rejected his child, Hosea could answer, I have not rejected my daughter, but God has disavowed you, has disavowed Israel. And so God has loved his people. He proved it in many ways. But now he says, I'm going to withdraw that love and no longer show you any mercy. The implication is that the fall of Israel is on its way. Warren Wiersbe says that the expression of God's love is certainly unconditional, but our enjoyment of that love is conditional and depends on our faith and obedience. God's love toward us is unconditional. He expects us to be faithful and obedient. What's more, he's going to take his vow away, and he's going to take the Israelites off into captivity, as well as we'll see later on the people of Judah as well. The city of Samaria would fall. It would fall to Shalmaneser the fifth. In 725 BC, he came and surrounded the city for 3 years. They finally surrendered, and we've talked about that story before in the book of the Kings, where they were taken off into captivity, scattered. The 10 tribes scattered throughout that area. We call them today the 10 lost tribes. But he says, I'm going to show love to the house of Judah. And the reference here is to the time of King Hezekiah, when Sennacherib came and invaded and surrounded Jerusalem in 701 BC. And Hezekiah and Isaiah prayed, and the angel of the Lord came into the midst of that Assyrian army, and in one night, 185,000 soldiers died in the night. And so Sennacherib had to break camp and go home, and then he was killed as soon as he got home. So we see that Hosea's prophecies are accurate. Another question comes out from this. Why did God show compassion to Judah and not to Israel? Well, most commentators say that Israel's sins had reached a point of no return. And while Judah had godless kings, they also had some godly kings. Hezekiah is an example of that. And eventually, Judah would experience the same degradation of idolatry that Israel practiced, but they'd not reached that point yet. But they would, and they would go off into captivity into Babylonia. Now let's look at verses 8 and following, and the story of his family life continues. After she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, Gomer had another son. Then the Lord said, call him Lo-Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the Israelites will be like the sand of the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it is said to them, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will be reunited, and they will appoint one leader and will come out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Now, here we have this second child with a name that has significance. It's really a symbol saying, I'm going to divorce you. You're not going to be my people, and I'm not going to be your God, because the Scripture really portrays God's union with the nation of Israel, the Israelites, as a marriage through the covenant. They keep the covenant, God keeps them. But he says, I will no longer be your God. You'll not be my people, I'll not be your God. But then in verse 11, he says, one day the people of Israel and the people of Judah will come back together. They'll come back together and be reunited. That's really what God wanted. He didn't want them to be separate. They had gone against his leadership in being separated in the first place. So here we have Hosea's family. Hosea's family is a walking witness against Israel, God's family. They symbolize God's rejection of Israel. In fact, when God says here that I am not your God, it can even be translated as I am not, I am to you. Remember that name came from Moses' first meeting with God? He said, who shall I say has sent me? And he said, you tell them that I am has sent you. And so I am not, I am to you. Now, in chapter 2, we see that now Hosea decides to build a case against Gomer, which is actually building a case against Israel. He talks along the lines of saying that she's not my wife, she's adulterous, she has an adulterous look on her face. Make her, that God says he's going to make her, or Hosea says he's going to make her like a desert, that she's been unfaithful, all of those things. But again, remember, this is the relationship of Gomer to Israel. They are the same. Now, look in chapter 2, verse 6. We'll go down and start there. He says, because of that, therefore, I will block her path with thorn bushes. I will wall her in, so that she cannot find her way. She will chase after her lovers, but not catch them. She will look for them, but not find them. Then she will say, I will go back to my husband as at first, for then I was better off than now. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, who lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. In the first 5 verses there, he's starting to build his case, and he continues that in verses 6 and 7, saying that she's been adulterous and unfaithful and a disgrace. She's been a disgrace. In verse 8, he says she refuses to acknowledge the one who has supplied her needs. In fact, the implication is she thinks that her needs have been supplied by her lovers. But that's not the case. God supplies all blessings for people. And we need to be thankful to the true God for His blessings of food and water and clothing. And she was giving that to the people who had been her lovers. And she says that Hosea says this is great ingratitude. Now that he builds his case, the verdict comes. And it says, I will block her path and wall her in. I'm going to take care of her. I'm going to block her path and wall her in. She won't be able to go out pursuing these lovers any longer. Now, beginning in verse 9, God lays down the sentence. He says, therefore, I will take away my grain when it ripens, and my new wine when it is ready. I will take back my wool and my linen, intended to cover her nakedness. So now I will expose her lewdness before the eyes of her lovers. No one will take her out of my hands. I will stop all her celebrations, her yearly festivals, her new moons, her Sabbath days, all her appointed feasts. I will ruin her vines and her fig tree, which she said were her pay from her lovers. I will make them a thicket, and wild animals will devour them. I will punish her for the days she burned incense to the Baals. She decked herself with rings and jewelry and went after her lovers, but she forgot me, declares the Lord. The verdict's in, and here's what God says. It's going to take away her sustenance, her grain. He's going to take away what her clothing comes from, the wool and the linen. He's going to expose her for what she is, her lewdness. He's going to stop these celebrations of Baal that she's been a part of. And He's going to ruin the things that He supplied for her that she took for granted, the vines and the fig trees. And He's going to punish her for the days that she burned incense to the Baals. And it is a kind of sentence that you would expect. She's done things wrong, so now she's going to be punished. But God surprises us. He always does. Remember what I said about the message of Hosea. Redemption is always in the message of these prophets. And in verse 14, God says, therefore, I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the desert and speak tenderly to her. That's in exile. There I will give her back to her vineyards, and will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she will sing as in the days of her youth, as in the days she came up out of Egypt. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will the names be invoked. In that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down in safety. Sound like the Garden of Eden? Yeah. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. In that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth, and the earth will respond to the grain, the new wine, oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show you my love to the one I called, not my loved one. I will say to those called, not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. That's what God wants to see happen. And He starts this off, this is a part of the sentence now, starts it off by saying, I will allure her like a lover. In the wilderness days, God had courted and won over the Israelites, he would again speak new and tender, heart-stirring words to her. And once more, he would offer her vineyards that would supply her needs. It says he's going to give back the vineyards in the valley of Achor, will become a door of hope. Now, the significance of the valley of Achor needs to be understood here. It was a place of judgment, because if you remember, it was a place where Achan and his family were stoned because of what Achan did in the fall of Jericho by taking forbidden items. And so they're going to forget about it being a valley of judgment, because it's going to become a valley of hope. He's going to remove the names of the Baals from their lips. You won't be saying those names anymore. They'd have a new vocabulary, and Baal would not be a part of it. He would betroth you to me forever. God says we're going to be remarried. They were married one time at Mount Sinai by the covenant, but he said we're going to redo that. It's going to be from God's own initiative. It will be permanent, because it's done on the basis of God's character. And God's character is the same. It's always the same. God's righteousness and His justice, His steadfast love, His mercy, and His faithfulness represent the bride price. That's what He's going to give for Israel to be His bride. And so the land will be like it's never been before. You won't have to be praying to an idol. That He's going to provide the rain, and the ground's going to respond to the moisture that comes from the rain, and it will produce like it's never produced before. It is the picture of a restored universe. As I said before, does it sound like the Garden of Eden? Somewhat. And then as we go on and look in chapter 3, Hosea gets this word from God. The Lord said to me, "Go show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a laphek of barley. Then I told her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will live with you. For the Israelites will live many days without a king or a prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or idol. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to His blessings in the last days." So what he speaks here is of vital importance, because he says, I want you, Hosea, I want you to go and redeem your wife who's been faithless, who's been an adulteress. And I want you to love her like I love these people. And I want you to carry out in your own relationship the things that you have seen in me, where I've been faithful to the people of Israel. And as Hosea did it, he understood more perfectly the heart of God. So I bought her, he says. I bought her. This was not an exorbitant price that he pays, because usually in the Bible, a slave sells for 30 pieces of silver. He paid 15 pieces, half price in silver, if you will. And he paid a day's ration in grain. He retrieved her from slavery. We need to remember that God was willing to retrieve the people of Israel. But more importantly, He was willing to retrieve and purchase at a tremendous cost, with the precious blood of His only Son, all sinners who are willing to confess Christ. So Hosea took Gomer. She would live with him in total celibacy for many days, which suggests the time when they would resume the normal life as a husband and wife. The goal here was the resumption of the covenant relationship between Israel and Yahweh. In the same vein, the Israelites would be without a king or a prince for many years, but there would be a day that would come when they would have a king forever. And the Lord would come to them and they would go back to that covenant relationship with God. It is an astounding love. It is the kind of love that should come from us. We should learn from this, that God expects us to have a love that results in action in our lives and how we relate to other people. G. Campbell Morgan relates the story of a young lady who had surrendered to the mission field, and she went to see her pastor. She was from Dallas, Texas, and she went to see the pastor and to say goodbye before she left to go to the mission field in China. He says to her, "Well, lassie, I'm glad you love these Chinese well enough to give your life for them." To which she quickly replied, "Oh, Dr. Schofield, don't make any mistake. I don't love the Chinese. I have absolutely no love for them. I rather dislike them." He said, "Why are you going?" "Why am I going? Because I love the Lord, and He has told me to go." After 7 years, she came home on her first furlough, and she went to see her pastor, and she said, "Dr. Schofield, do you remember what I said to you in this room when I was going out to China?" He said, "Yes, I very well remember." She said, "I told you I did not love the Chinese a bit. Dr. Schofield, I was telling you the truth, but I love them now. I went because I loved the Lord, but now I love them, and I did not even want to come home on furlough." That is the principle. Go love a woman, he went. He bought her. He put her in the place of deprivation on the way to restoration, and by, love came. Thus he had touched God in the activity that seeks to save, and he had touched God in the deepest joy of life. Here's the bottom line. It's not enough to know that God is love. If we know it, He calls us to act in correspondence with that love in our dealings with people. In the same way, Christ acted out the perfect love when He gave what no other one could do on Calvary. 1 Peter captures it in verses 18 and 19 of chapter 1. "For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect." We are to imitate Christ. We're to imitate His love. I love the way that the hymn writer captures that idea in our relationship to Jesus Christ. When he wrote, "I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene and wonder how He could love me, a sinner, condemned unclean. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. For me it was in the garden He prayed, not my will but thine. He had no tears for His own griefs, but sweat drops of blood for mine. He took my sins and my sorrows, He made them His very own. He bore the burden to Calvary and suffered and died alone. When with the ransomed in glory His face I at last shall see, 'twill be my joy through the ages to sing of His love for me." That's the love that Christ has for us. Join me on that first stanza if you know this song. "I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene, and wonder how He could love me, a sinner condemned unclean. Oh, how marvelous, oh, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. Oh, how marvelous, oh, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me." And His love for me is just as His love for you. All you have to do is receive it. I hope you have a good week.